A 14-year-old boy is standing in a field outside London, surrounded by 30,000 armed peasants. He's the King of England, and he's terrified. In front of him, on horseback, is a Tyler from Kent, a man who lays roof tiles for a living. No title, no army of his own, no land, no noble blood anywhere in his family tree. In the next 60 seconds, this man is going to be dead, pulled off his horse in front of the king he came here to negotiate with, in front of thousands of the very people who followed him here. But for one single day in English history, a peasant held more power than the crown. The king needed something from him, not the other way around. This is the story of Wat Tyler, and how close England came to a revolution 400 years before anyone thought one was possible. To understand why a roof tiler could march on London with an army behind him, you have to understand what England looked like in the year 1381. This isn't a story that starts with the tax. It starts decades earlier, with a disease. 30 years before this, the Black Death had wiped out around a third of the population. Entire villages disappeared. Some never reopened. That's a catastrophe by any measure. But for the peasants who survived it, the plague accidentally created something they had never had before: leverage. Before the plague, there were more workers than there was work that needed doing. Lords paid almost nothing, and peasants had no real choice but to accept it. After the plague, that math flipped completely. Fewer workers meant labor was suddenly worth something. Peasants started telling their lords they wanted higher wages. If a lord refused, they simply walked to the next village and got paid more for exactly the same work. For the first time in generations, ordinary laborers had something resembling bargaining power. The nobility hated this. So Parliament passed the Statute of Laborers, a law that froze wages at pre-plague levels and told peasants they were no longer allowed to leave their lord's land looking for better pay. In effect, the people who had just watched the plague kill their neighbors were told they had to stay poor and stay put. Then came the wars. England was deep into the 100 Years' War against France. Wars are expensive. So the crown did what cash-strapped governments have always done. It taxed the people who could least afford it, because the people who could most afford it had the lawyers and the connections to avoid it. 3 poll taxes in 4 years. Flat taxes. The same amount whether you were a wealthy merchant or a starving farmhand. Parliament essentially told the country that a man with nothing owed the crown the same debt as a man with everything. Most people thought that was deeply unfair. One of those people was about to do something about it. Tax collectors went from village to village trying to collect the new poll tax. A huge number of people simply weren't there anymore. On paper, they had vanished from the tax rolls entirely. Some had genuinely died. Some had moved. But a significant number had simply stopped reporting, quietly hoping nobody would follow up. In the spring of the year 1381, the government stopped ignoring it. Commissioners were sent out to find the missing taxpayers and collect the money by force if necessary. In Essex, a commissioner named John Bampton rode into the town of Brentwood. He told the villagers they owed the crown their tax money, and that he wasn't leaving without it. The villagers gave him a very different answer. Then they drove him out of town. When royal officials sent soldiers to restore order, the surrounding villages refused to back down. They fought back. Within days, much of Essex was in open revolt. News reached Kent almost immediately. There, a man named Wat Tyler told the people around him that if Essex was marching, Kent should march too. And he said he would lead them. Very little is known about Wat Tyler before this moment. He may have served as a soldier in France during the 100 Years' War, which could explain the confidence and discipline he showed almost immediately. He was almost certainly a Tyler by trade, a man who laid roof tiles for a living. That is probably where his name came from. He appears in the historical record almost out of nowhere. No famous family, no noble title, no earlier leadership role recorded by chroniclers. Yet within days, he was leading tens of thousands of people. That is the remarkable part. This wasn't a nobleman raising an army from his own estates. This was an ordinary tradesman who stepped forward, told desperate people he would stand at the front, and they chose to follow him. No one knows exactly why it was him instead of thousands of other angry men. What happened next had never happened before in English history. The rebels didn't stay local. They marched on London. Along the way, they stopped at a prison and freed a preacher named John Ball. Ball had been imprisoned for preaching ideas the church considered dangerous. He told the growing crowd that nobles and peasants were equal in God's eyes. He argued that the gap between them existed because of custom, not because heaven had created it. He asked why some men wore velvet while others wore rags, when birth alone did not make one person more worthy than another. That message, spread through the rebel ranks faster than any complaint about taxes ever could. A tax can be repealed. A question about whether society itself is fair is much harder to silence. By the middle of June, the rebels reached London. One important detail is often forgotten. London did not truly resist them. The city had walls. It had gates. It could have tried to keep them out. Instead, many ordinary Londoners sympathized with the rebels. The gates were opened from inside. The poor of the city shared many of the same grievances as the poor in the countryside. Many joined the march instead of resisting it. Once inside the city, the rebels were anything but aimless. They had specific targets. Their first destination was the Savoy Palace, the London residence of John of Gaunt, the king's uncle and one of the most powerful and unpopular men in England. What happened there surprised even contemporary witnesses. The rebels did not loot the palace. Instead, they deliberately destroyed it. Gold, silver, and expensive clothing were thrown into the river rather than stolen. They wanted everyone to understand that this was not robbery. It was a reckoning. Their next destination was the Tower of London itself. The guards were ordered to stand aside. They did. The rebels entered one of the most secure buildings in England without a fight. They found two of the king's most senior officials hiding inside: Simon Sudbury, the Archbishop of Canterbury, and Robert Hales, the Treasurer of England. Both men were taken to Tower Hill and executed. Their heads were placed on pikes on London Bridge for the entire city to see. The message was unmistakable. Farmers, craftsmen, and laborers had executed two of the most powerful men in the kingdom. There was no longer any way for the crown to pretend this was only a minor disturbance. So the king, 14-year-old Richard II, did something that was either incredibly brave or incredibly desperate. He rode out to meet the rebels in person. Twice. The first meeting took place at Mile End. Richard rode up to the gathered rebels and told them he had heard their demands. He agreed to them. He said serfdom would end. Rents would be fair. Trade would be free. Everyone who had marched on London would receive a full pardon. Royal scribes wrote the promises onto parchment in front of the crowd. The peasants were officially told they were now free men. For a moment, it looked as though the crisis was over. Many of the rebels believed they had won. Satisfied and exhausted, large numbers of them began the journey home. But Wat Tyler wasn't finished. He believed there were still questions the king had not answered. Questions about the wealth of the church. Questions about who truly controlled the land. So Tyler sent word to Richard that he wanted one more meeting. The location would be Smithfield. That meeting would decide everything. Every surviving written account of what happened at Smithfield came from the side that ultimately won. No supporter of Tyler survived to leave an official record. What happened next has been debated ever since. Tyler rode close to the king, closer than royal protocol normally allowed. Some chroniclers claimed he behaved aggressively. Others said he simply negotiated with the confidence of a man who believed he held the advantage. Accounts even disagree about whether Tyler reached toward his dagger or simply gestured while speaking. Whatever happened in those tense moments, the Lord Mayor of London, William Walworth, decided Tyler posed a threat to the king. Walworth drew his sword. He struck Tyler. Tyler was pulled from his horse. He was wounded again as he fell. He was carried into a nearby hospital. Walworth's men followed him inside. There, they killed him. His body was dragged back outside. His head was cut off. It was placed on a pike on London Bridge, beside the heads of the Archbishop of Canterbury and the Treasurer of England. In a matter of minutes, the rebellion had lost its leader. The rebel army stood stunned. Then the young king did something remarkable. Richard rode forward alone. He faced thousands of armed rebels without Tyler standing between them. He told the crowd that he was still their king. He told them he would be their leader now. He ordered them to follow him. Amazingly, they did. Without Tyler, the movement lost its direction. The rebellion dissolved with astonishing speed. Within weeks, royal forces were moving through the rebel counties, hunting down the remaining leaders of the uprising. One by one, they were captured. John Ball, the preacher whose words had inspired so many people, was eventually arrested. He was executed, bringing an end to one of the rebellion's most influential voices. The promises made at Mile End did not last. Once the immediate danger had passed, Richard II withdrew the concessions he had granted. The pardons were canceled. The promises of freedom were revoked. The reforms that had seemed so close simply disappeared. According to later accounts, Richard reportedly declared that the peasants had been villains before the rebellion, and villains they would remain. The documents that had promised change became meaningless once the crown no longer needed them. Serfdom did not disappear overnight. It survived for many decades after Wat Tyler's death. But the deeper economic forces that had helped spark the rebellion never went away. The Black Death had permanently reduced England's population. Workers remained scarce. Landowners continued struggling to find enough labor. Year after year, those pressures slowly weakened the old feudal system until it became increasingly difficult to enforce. So, did Wat Tyler fail? In the short term, the answer is yes. He was killed. His followers were defeated. The rebellion was crushed. The system he challenged remained in place for generations. Yet the story did not truly end there. The poll tax that helped ignite the revolt became a lasting warning to future governments. For centuries, English rulers remembered the danger of pushing desperate people beyond their limits. When a modern version of the poll tax returned in 1990, it sparked major protests and riots across Britain. Many historians consider those events an important factor in the political downfall of the prime minister who introduced it. More than 6 centuries separated the two moments. But the lesson was strikingly similar. When ordinary people believe a system has become fundamentally unfair, pressure can build quietly for years before it suddenly erupts. Wat Tyler was only a Tyler from Kent. For roughly 2 weeks, he forced the King of England to negotiate with him almost as an equal. He lost that struggle. He paid for it with his life. But more than 600 years later, his story is still remembered. Not because he won, but because, for one extraordinary moment, the established order blinked. If you enjoyed this story and want to continue the series, the next chapter follows Richard II, the young king whose reign was forever shaped by the events at Smithfield. Subscribe for more history that explains not only what happened, but why it still matters today.